Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Garrett. I'm Natural Resources, Environment, and Energy Educator for Illinois Extension. I am based in southernmost Illinois, and happy to be with you today to be doing Which Grass is Which webinar series. I started this webinar series, back in 2020 when we had a little extra time on our hands. And I haven't done this full webinar series like we have it laid out for this week since that time. So it's been about 6 years since we've done kind of the 3 day, more intensive format. So I'm excited that you're joining us today. Um, like I said, we're recording this today, so we will be emailing that out to you as well as the rest of the week's sessions once they're up and on YouTube and closed captioned and all that good stuff. So it might take a week or two before that's available, but if you're not able to make all 3 days and have to miss one or two, we will get those recordings to you. Today we're going to start we kind of have two sessions today. The first half-ish of the talk is going to focus on just the basics of how we identify grasses, what makes a grass, what are characteristics that we're going to use to do identification. And then the second half is going to focus on identifying specific woodland grasses. Um, Again, I know there are folks from outside of Illinois. This is focused on Illinois specific grasses. Some of them, especially in today's with the woodland grasses, are more focused on southern Illinois, but that's not the case for the majority of them. So there is a little bit of a focus on southern Illinois grasses today. And then tomorrow we'll move into our prairie grasses, and then Thursday we'll look at nuisance grasses. So that can be just weedier native grasses or non-native or invasive grasses that we can find kind of across the state. So that's kind of the breakdown of how this week will work. We are going to have some quizzes and some other components. We'll ask for some participation. So at those times, please use the chat box and share your answers or your thoughts. If you have other questions today, put them in the chat box. You may have heard me talking to Kim. Kim is in the background. She is our co-host today and helping moderate the session. So if you have any questions, technical difficulties, you can message Kim directly or just put it in the chat and she'll take care of that for everyone today. Okay. And then just a few things with your view. I am going to try to leave my video on because I think it's hard to be in a 2 hour class and not see who's talking to you. So you should be able, right now, you should see the PowerPoint full screen. And then you may have like me and other participants on the side. You can change your view. I like to change it to like side by side. That kind of puts the speaker on the side and moves the whole PowerPoint over. So you should be able to toggle those for yourself or just hide me if you don't want to look at me talking to you today. So just know that's there. There's closed captions that you can turn off, on or off depending on your preferences. So all of those are there for you. Um, Again, in the email we sent out, there are the handouts. The handouts include a basics of Grass ID handout and then the PowerPoints for all 3 days. So hopefully you got those. And I think that's what we're going to start. We're going to get started. So the first question I have for you all is to share with us in the chat how you rank your personal grass identification skills. And I'm going to give you a scale on a scale of 0 being absolutely nothing, can't identify a single grass, to 10 being the expert. And if anyone says 10, I'm just going to turn the PowerPoint over to you and you can teach the class because I wouldn't even put myself at a 10. But go ahead, share in there just so we can see where you're at. I see some zeros. I appreciate the honesty. I'm here for it. Nothing wrong with that at all. Grasses are difficult. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Lots of twos. I like it. Lots of twos. Okay. Okay. This is great. Okay. Excellent. Well, keeping that in mind, I have some repeat people. Welcome back. We're gonna get into today. Um, And for those that don't know me, my background in grass identification has come from just doing a lot of field work, being out in mostly prairies in the Midwest, identifying grasses for different internships that I had or my master's degree in plant biology, and having to just go out and figure out what these grasses are. So we're going to try to keep things field-based. We're going to do a little terminology, but not a lot of complex terminology. And we're definitely not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of grass ID. We're going to try to keep it as simple as possible. So, of course, with that, there's limitations, but we'll do the best that we can. Okay, so we're going to get started today with just talking about the basics of what makes a grass, because oftentimes even that is a difficult thing to tell sometimes. So there's kind of 5 characteristics that we can use that are simple to see. The first thing about grasses is that they fit into a category of plants called monocotyledons. Okay, we call them monocots for short. And they have a bunch of different characteristics, but 2 that are relevant for the grasses and easy to see is that when a monocot first starts to grow, when it starts to germinate, it has only 1 cotyledon, and that's a seed leaf. So it's the first initial leaf that starts to grow when a seed germinates. So in this top photo, this is some switchgrass that I planted that was just starting to germinate. You can see just individual leaf blades coming up. So 1 cotyledon or seed leaf. And that's, in comparison to another group of plants we call dicots, which means they have 2 cotyledons or seed leaves. So think of a lot of things in your vegetable garden like a radish, right? If that starts to grow, you see 2 little paired leaves that come up first. That's in contrast to the grasses. Grasses also are going to have parallel veins in their leaves. We can see that in the bottommost picture here. So another characteristic you can use to differentiate it from other groups of plants. Unfortunately for us, grasses don't have showy flowers, and that's often what we use in identification, right? Is we love to get our picture color field guide, look at a flower and be able to identify it. Grasses don't have that, but that doesn't mean that they don't have your standard flower components. This picture in the middle is a side oats grama grass. I think it's stunning and beautiful in bloom, but you have to have a trained eye. You can see how small this plant is in comparison to my hand. So not showy flowers, but definitely lots of characteristics that we're going to look at that will be helpful in identification. Another thing that's a little different about grasses is what we think of as a typical leaf blade is a little bit different in a grass. Leaves are going to wrap around stems and form a structure called a sheath. So in this picture on the right, you can see kind of our traditional leaf blade here, and then hopefully you can see how that wraps around this stem. So this structure here is called a sheath. That's something you're going to find in the grasses, and that's going to be a little bit different from maybe the sedges or the rushes, and we'll look at those on the next couple slides. Finally, grasses have hollow stems. So if you were to snip one and look inside, it would be hollow. And they also are jointed. So that means that they have these swellings or these nodes. We also call them joints at the base of where that leaf sheath ends. Okay, so this right here is a sheath covering a stem. It ends at a node. Below, we can see this is the stem right here, and this is another sheath that's covering that. So a few different things you can look at to tell that what you're looking at is a grass. And that's important because, I get a lot of questions about how to identify grasses, as you could imagine. People send me pictures or they bring things into the office. And a lot of times what they're bringing me is not a grass, but it's a sedge, which is a grass-like plant, but is different. So how can we tell them apart? In sedges, their stems don't have those joints or those nodes. They're also not hollow. So in this picture on the left here, you can kind of see that when I snipped that sedge, there's like a pith or a filling inside of that stem rather than it being hollow. Another thing you find in a lot of sedges, but not all of them, is a triangular stem. That's kind of the easiest, most quick ID characteristic for most of the sedges, is to just either, again, snip it like I did here, or roll the stem between your fingers and see if it's triangular. Okay, in the sedges, because they have that triangular stem, it means that they have something called three-ranked leaves, or leaves that come from three sides of the stem. Okay, and that's again going to be something characteristic for the sedges. The three pictures on the right are just different examples of the flowering structures of sedges. Again, we're not going to get into that identification because sedges are a whole other beast. And I focus so much on grasses that I haven't had time to really get into the sedges. So there are other experts out there that could teach you about that. But I just kind of want to show you because once you see sedges, you'll see that they start to have a different look to them when they're in flower and it should be able to kind of tell the difference between them and the grass once we get good at some grass ID here. Okay. Another group of grass-like plants are the rushes. Okay. Rushes tend to be in more of our wetter areas, but not always. And they are going to have round stems that are not jointed or hollow. And they typically have only a few leaves, if even any. So this stem over here is going to be round, and you're going to have, you see just one, maybe two leaves along the stem, so very, very few. This is kind of examples of the flowers of a rush, and then when it's in seed. So again, it's going to look a little bit different than our grasses. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just so you can kind of see some of those main characteristics that tell them apart. There are different sayings to help you remember, sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have joints from the stem to the ground. There's other variations of it that you may have heard before, but those are good. Just know in general, plants don't always follow the rules. So like sedges don't always have edges, but most of the time. Okay, so hopefully you're here at this webinar series because you want to know why which grass is which and tell the difference between them. But sometimes, we kind of come back to that question is why does it really matter? It's a grass is a grass, right? But just like any other group of plants, there's a lot of grasses out there. They have a high degree of diversity in general, right, in our ecosystems. If we have a higher degree of diversity of native grasses, we're going to have a more robust, higher quality ecosystem. So always good to kind of know what you have out there, what's missing, if you're doing restoration work, right? Like putting in multiple grasses rather than just one species, kind of understanding that nuance is really important. And then for a lot of us, we're always going to kind of have the lens of, for those that are in the management world, right, understanding and managing for impacts of non-native and invasive grasses. So I kind of put these two pictures here, and if you're really good at your grass ID and you want to guess what's in each of these pictures, go for it, put it in the chat. But I have one picture of, we'd say more of a monoculture of a native grass and one that's definitely a monoculture of an invasive grass here. And so understanding, right, if there's a big batch of a grass growing, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It could be a desirable grass. So it is important to know which is which and how to manage in those different circumstances. So I see some pros in the chat. We've got reed canary grass on the right. Yes, we'll talk about that one on Thursday. And then little blue stem on the left. We'll talk about that one tomorrow. So again, just being able to recognize what you have and what work needs to be done to either protect it, promote it, or maybe manage it and try to change what's growing there. Okay, so like I kind of said at the beginning, we're going to be doing a simpler approach to grass ID. We're really going to focus on characteristics that for the most part you can see out in the field. Now that may be out in the field using a hand lens, depending on how well your eyesight is, but not needing to be in a lab under a microscope or anything like that. We're going to use those field-based characteristics to the best of our ability and move forward with that. So as we get started today, we're going to go through some terms. We do need to go through some terms so we're all on the same page. A really great overview of this is going to be in that Grass ID handout, basics handout, like a 6-page thing that's always good to kind of have printed off with some examples and pictures. But we're going to go through these together and look at some examples, and then we'll get into the actual Grass ID. So the first thing we want to look at on this line drawing of a grass here is the stem, right? Luckily for us, most of the time you'll see the term stem that's used, but you may also see this word culm in reference to a stem. I'm not really going to use that one, but just know if you're looking in ID books, that is what that term means. And then we already mentioned that a leaf typically has 3 parts. And I should put my labels up here. I should click through as I'm talking. Here we go. So the first part, what we typically think of as a leaf, is going to be called the blade. Okay, this part of the grass leaf. And then that leaf is going to wrap around the stem and form a structure called the sheath. Okay, where that sheath ends, you're going to have that swelling called a node or a joint. Okay, and then we can see that repeated here again. We've got our blade, our sheath, and our node. Okay, it's important to be able to distinguish between what's the stem and what's the sheath, because sometimes you can have a smooth stem and a hairy leaf sheath. But if you think that that sheath is the stem and you see hairs on it, and you're like, oh, well, it's supposed to be smooth, that might throw you off. That was something that I had to learn for a while, because sometimes the sheaths overlap so closely that you can barely even see the stem. So just something to keep in mind. Another term to be familiar with is the collar region. The collar region is that juncture where the blade becomes the sheath. That part on the grass is going to have some different characteristics potentially that are excellent for grass identification. So a lot of the times when I'm identifying a grass, one of the first things I'll do, especially if it's not in bloom, is I'll pull that leaf blade back and look and see what characteristics I can find there. We're looking for things like ligules, auricles, or horns, and we'll look at what those are in the next few slides. But just know, collar region, good place to look. And then finally, the inflorescence is going to be the flowering portion of the grass with the reproductive structures. So an inflorescence is just a collection of flowering parts, and we'll look at the different types of those again in a few slides. But let's focus on ligules here. Ligules can come in different forms, and they're not always there. So my first example is a picture of a ligule, of no ligule, nothing present right here. So you can see again how I do that in this picture. I pulled that leaf blade back. You can see the sheath is here. And what we're looking for is something right here. And in this grass, there's nothing there. There's nothing to see. But in other cases, what we're looking for is a collection of hairs or some sort of membrane, okay? And what is the purpose of this ligule? There could be different things out there. If you think about it, it's kind of helping seal that sheath closed on top so water and other components of the environment don't get into that leaf sheath, so it's kind of protecting that area. For us, again, it's a great identification tool. So in this case, we can see a really prominent velvety hairy ligule. Sometimes it looks like that. Sometimes it's just a few very, very short, small bristly hairs. It could be just a few long hairs. It varies. And then the membranous ligules are kind of, again, everything's relative here. We're not going to necessarily use exact measurements because we're trying to keep it approachable. So short versus tall. Okay. The membranous ligules are going to start off for the most part kind of white in color, kind of looks like a piece of skin that you pick off your finger, right? Like a white membrane. As you go later in the season, they can turn yellow, they can turn orange, they can turn brown. And especially as we get late into late summer and fall, sometimes these characteristics just aren't there anymore, right? Just normal wear and tear on the grass, being out in the elements. Sometimes those ligules just fall away. They're not there. So Keeping that in mind too with grass ID, sometimes every characteristic isn't there throughout the whole season. Okay, so we're going to look for ligules. A few other characteristics that are definitely less common, so it's kind of a win if you find one. It helps narrow down the grasses you're looking at, are things called auricles and horns. Okay, so an auricle is going to be this extra leafy material at the base of the sheath or the blade, right in that juncture that looks like arms hugging the stem, essentially. Okay, and it's really apparent if you pull that leaf blade back, you'll usually see those arms open up around that stem. They're not always different colors like in this picture here. This is a really good example of them. You can kind of see them. And again, this is really zoomed in. This is really small. So a little extra magnification can be helpful, but not necessary. And then there's a different structure called horns. And to my knowledge, at least in Illinois, there's only one grass that I've ever seen horns on, and that's Indian grass. So that's definitely a win, again, if you find it. But here's two different views. It's going to be this kind of stiff extension of the leaf sheath that goes up rather than out and around like an auricle. So you can see kind of blunt horns on this example versus really tall ones on this one over here. Okay. Okay, so moving on from kind of our vegetative characteristics to our flowering portion of the grass, just a few terms to point out here. Things got to get complicated. Our stem is no longer a stem. When it's part of the flowering structure, it's called a rachis. Um, but you might just hear me refer to it as the stem because that's easier. But technically, it's called a rachis. And then if we have little stalks that are along our rachis, we call them pedicels. But again, I often refer to them as stalks. And then maybe the most important term is spikelet. The spikelet is the flowering unit of a grass. This is going to contain all the reproductive structures. This is where our seed's going to develop. And there are lots of different layers and different parts and pieces to spikelets, and we're not going to go through any of those today. So if you are familiar with grass ID and like palea, lemma, gloom, those terms might sound familiar. We're not going to use any of that today because we are going to keep it strictly as simple as we can. But there are a couple, apparently there's my spikelet right there. There are a couple things that we're going to use that are great for helping in the field identification, and that's things called bristles and awns. Okay, so both of those bristles and awns, they're both bristle-like structures. But in the case of an actual bristle, they're going to be connected to and emerge from the bottom or the base of the spikelet. And they're usually found in multiples. So in my drawing here, this is the portion of the spikelet that would be attached to the rachis. And you can see that we have multiple different bristles emerging from the base. You're going to see this in something like a foxtail, very common. So if you were to pluck away a few spikelets, you'd see a little nest of bristles that came with it underneath. We're going to compare that to an awn, which is like a bristle, but it emerges from the tip of the spikelet rather than the base. Okay, and they vary in size, number, color. Again, what's the point of a bristle or an awn? We could probably guess this one. It doesn't look the most pleasant to eat the seeds that have awns on them. So to prevent herbivory is one of the main reasons. But again, for us, great for identification. So we can see in the leftmost picture, we have just individual awns emerging from these spikelets. Whereas in more of a bottlebrush grass, you're going to have multiples. So in this case, it's two. My line drawing has three. And then sometimes awns, excuse me, are very long and perform another structure. So this isn't a porcupine grass. And this awn can get, over 5 inches long. And as it dries, it twists and it helps drive that seed down into the soil. That one's like the coolest one that's out there. But again, they have different purposes, and it's a really, really easy identification feature. If it's in bloom, porcupine grass with those crazy long awns, super simple. Okay, we're going to move into the different arrangements of inflorescences. Okay, this is going to be kind of a lot of information. We're going to break it down, hopefully easily, so stick with me. But there's three main inflorescence types, and being able to determine which type, again, is going to be super helpful for identification. And we can do this by asking just a few paired questions. So the first question we're going to ask is our rachis or our stem of our inflorescence, is it branched or unbranched? Okay. If it's branched, we're going to call it a panicle. Okay. Now it can be difficult to tell if something is a branch or if it's a little stalk or pedicel. So even folks that do grass ID and botanists that determine these characteristics sometimes disagree over if something is one type of inflorescence or another. So there's a little nuance there and a little wiggle room. But here's a couple different examples of panicles. The one on the left is kind of a typical like big open area, lots of branches, whereas the one on the right is kind of more bent to the side with like collections of branches. Okay. If we take the other side, if we don't have branches, we can ask another question. We can ask if our spikelets are held on pedicels or little stalks, or if they're directly attached to the rachis or that stem. If they are, we call it a spike. Okay, so this one's the most simple and it looks like the name. So again, another win for us, a spike, just one central stem, all the spikelets directly attached to it. Okay, the kind of catch-all category, and I left this one for the end, is the raceme, because the definition's kind of complicated. You can have a unbranched rachis with all your spikelets held on little pedicels, right? Or in this case, we have like a finger-like collection of spikelets that are all attached with a small little stalk or pedicel to the main stem. Okay, so think of things like a crabgrass or a big blue stem. They have those long finger-like collections of spikelets. That fits into the raceme too. So typically for me, I determine is it a panicle or a spike, and if it's not, then it's in the catch-all category, which I call a raceme. So just to review, and have those characteristics all written for you on the slides, panicle's going to branch. Spikelets can be with or without pedicels. Spike all the way on the other side, no branches, no pedicels. Raceme, a little bit more complicated. Okay. Okay, we're gonna do a knowledge test. We're a half hour in. I hope I haven't lost you yet. We are gonna do a quiz. So I have four different parts of the grass labeled here. If you want to put in the chat your answers, what you think A, B, C, and D are labeled. D is referring to this structure right here. I didn't want to put it right on top so you couldn't see it. So A down here, B, C, and D. We'll take 2 minutes. Put your guesses in the chat. All right, excellent. Okay, we're doing great. So we're gonna go through them. This bottom one, A, is kind of tricky. This one is a leaf sheath. Okay, so this whole sheath is covering and it's gonna keep going down that grass. B over here, we could call it just a leaf. We could call it a leaf blade. Okay, blade would be more specific and targeted. C is going to be our stem or our culm. Some of you are overachievers. You put both of those in there. And then D, if we're talking about this structure right here, that's going to be a membranous ligule, okay, or just a ligule. But I did see some folks were putting in here like the collar region, and we could also say that. That's going to be this whole region right here, is going to be the collar region. So excellent job. Okay, we're going to do a few more quizzes for the different types of inflorescences because this can be tricky and it's hard to tell with the line drawings sometimes. So make your guess on this one here. What type of inflorescence does this grass have? And then I got a second question. If you can tell, again, it's always so difficult. This is so hard to do grass ID with a webinar, right? So we're going to do our best with pictures. But what's your guess? Does this grass have bristles or awns? Again, it's kind of a cruel question because it's so hard to tell in this one. But good conversation. I see lots of votes for spike. You are correct. This is a spike. And in this case, they are awns, okay? So again, impossible to tell. Therefore, a guess for you, but again, points out just the importance of maybe needing that magnification. And if we were in the field, right, we'd be able to tell that a lot easier. If you're curious, this is squirrel tail barley. We will talk about this grass a little bit later this week. Okay, next one, we have two different inflorescences. A and B, go ahead and make your guesses. And yes, awns come from the top, bristles are from the base. Okay, again, do your best with pictures. A and B, what do we got? And again, we're looking at type of inflorescences, type of inflorescence. Okay, seeing all the answers come in. Excellent. Lots of guesses for a spike for A. That is correct. And then B, I was trying to be tricky, and most of you got it. You said panicle, and again, that is correct. If you're curious what these grasses are, A is reed canary grass, and B is smooth brome. Their foliage can look very similar before they are in bloom, but we can see side by side pretty easy to tell that those are at least two different grasses. So A is reed canary grass, B is smooth brome, both non-native depending on where you are, treated as invasive. Um, Smooth brome is kind of on that line, again, depending on where you are. Okay, next one. This is going to be one of our rye grasses. Any guesses? Panicle, raceme, or spike? Can't fool you. You're all pros. Definitely a spike on this one. Okay, how about this one? This one is red top. If you are familiar with that grass, red top. Excellent again. Lots of guesses for panicle. So again, this is kind of the very typical panicle shape with lots of branches and then lots of spikelets spaced out all across those. So excellent job. And then how about this one? This one is gamma grass. Okay, excellent. Most of you are correct. This one is a raceme. So in this case, we're going to have these long finger-like collections of spikelets that are attached with a little stalk or pedicel. It's really tricky sometimes, but we're going to go with raceme for this one. Okay, let's just talk about a few other helpful hints or terms you might see when we're describing grasses. Our grasses, just like a lot of our other plants, we can categorize them as either annuals or perennials for the most part. Um, a lot of the times if you see a grass that pops up in your garden or in like more of a managed like small scale home landscape and you don't know what it is, if I tell people to give it a little tug, if it comes right out right away, most of those are going to be annuals, okay? Versus a perennial grass, if you gave it a tug, it wouldn't budge at all because it's there and it's going to stay year after year. So sometimes being able to distinguish between annual or perennial, not so much helpful in identification, but definitely going to be helpful when you move forward in management. Our annuals usually categorize as either like a winter annual or a summer annual, again, depending on when they grow. But with our perennial plants, most of the time, we're going to use terms cool season and warm season grasses. This goes back to their method of photosynthesis. We're not going to get into that today, but they have slightly different methods of undergoing photosynthesis. So our cool season grasses, for our purposes, are those that are going to green up very early in the spring, some even in the early winter months or the late winter months, early spring. They're going to green up, start to grow that foliage, and then they're going to flower very early in the season. So in spring or early summer. Warm season grasses are going to need those warmer temperatures, and they're going to wait until maybe later spring, early summer to really green up and get that foliage growing, and then flower later summer into fall. So we're here end of July right now. So a lot of the cool season grasses have already bloomed, and some have even senesced or started to have their foliage die back for the year. That often comes with a color change. The foliage often turns more of a straw color or even a gray color. Versus our warm season grasses are just starting up with that flowering right now. So if someone brought me a sample right now of a grass and it looked kind of grayer, I would say, oh, that's probably the flowering structure of this year's cool season grass. So knowing that differentiation can again help you kind of categorize what type of grass you're looking at. We can also look at how these plants grow. So in this picture here, this is an example of a bunch grass growing in a landscape bed that you can see very clearly defined bunches. Versus more of our spreading plants that spread through rhizomes, like something like a Johnson grass, that's going to spread very quickly and form dense colonies. Unfortunately, you're going to find that spreading habit or growth form in a lot of our non-native and a lot of our invasive grasses, which makes them just all the more challenging to eradicate. But these are some of the terms we'll also be using as we go through these different grass profiles. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on that before we move into specific species. Does anyone have any questions? We're going to do kind of a break check right now, see if we have any just general questions on grass identification overall before we move into our woodland grasses. And I'll pause and see, Kim, if you have anything that you want to mention. I know we flooded the chat with a lot of answers.
We have a few good questions. Some of them included what magnification do you recommend from the field? And I put in 10x is best for the field. 20x can be difficult, but I didn't know if folks were interested in your personal ones that you use. And another question that was in the chat that isn't necessarily pertaining to grass identification, but is there a percentage of grasses that we tend to put in our Midwestern native plantings? And I said it ranged based on the management goals and management options to take care of that planting.
Yeah, for sure. Really great questions. So yeah, for the magnification, I don't typically use a hand lens, so I'm not really helpful in that. But yeah, I would start with a very low magnification at first and see if that's enough. And then you could step it up. And then yeah, just like Kim said, with if you're doing restoration work or more of a pollinator planting, those seeding rates are really going to depend on a lot of different factors and what your goals are, what was previously in that site. So that is a complicated, nuanced question. We can chat about it if you want to send me an email and you have a specific question. But yeah, I like the conversation. Mhm.
And the last question that just came in was for weeding purposes, what are good ideas when you have a grass that might be under 6 inches?
Oh, that's a good question. So, like, if you have a small grass that's popped up, what is the easiest way to identify it? That's kind of what I'm getting from that question. Um, it's very challenging. A lot of the times, with like in a home landscape with weeding, again, a weed is a plant out of place. So, in that case, if it's a grass that pops up and you're unsure what it is, if you're willing to leave it and wait for it to flower and see what it is, you can do that. That's my recommendation if you like want to know what that grass is and you want an ID. Most of the time, they're going to be undesirable, like weedy, like a crabgrass or a barnyard grass that pops up in your landscape. Um, but yeah, it is very challenging to identify grasses with just a couple leaves. And those are the pictures and the calls and the people that come in with samples that I get that I say I honestly just don't know. Sometimes it's just you just can't tell. So that's my recommendation is if you're okay with it and you really want to know, leave it, let it flower, but then probably pull it right away, so it doesn't set seed if it's something undesirable, right? I did have someone do that. I had someone email me. I said, wait for it to flower. They got back to me 2 weeks later, and it ended up being definitely not what they wanted planted, and they pulled it out the next day. So, um, that's one way that works. Any other questions?
This is another management question that just came in. I managed a prairie planting that was seeded in the fall a few years ago. That first spring, there were tons of grasses coming up in the spring. Can I assume that those are non-native cool season grasses?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, if it's really early in the spring, a lot of the times that's going to be cool season. However, I will say, it depends on where you are. It depends on, all right, I'm in far southern Illinois. So again, different situation, but like I'll have warm season grasses that start to green up in April. So it really does depend. We'd have to kind of look into that a little bit more nuanced, than just kind of assuming cool season, non-native. And just because it's a cool season grass doesn't mean it's non-native. There are native cool season grasses too. So,
And then another question just came in as we go through the species in your slides. Will you tell us if other species are lookalikes, if that's applicable?
sure. Yeah, I didn't include specific look-alike comparisons for the most part because we're going to talk about a lot of the different grasses either back to back, or across all of these days, and it gets really repetitive. But yes, I will do my best to mention other lookalikes as we go. Had to limit it somewhat. We scheduled 6 hours of grass ID, folks. I didn't think you wanted more than that. But yeah, we'll do our best. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for the questions, for participating in the little quizzes that I had. We're going to get going and move into our woodland grasses. This is the smallest collection of grasses we're going to look at today. We've got 12 different species. So that being said, we'll probably end a little bit early. I wanted to schedule this longer just to make sure that we had enough time to get to them all today. But we'll move into those now. So when we're talking about woodland grasses, the grasses we're focused on today are adapted to growing in at least part shade. And just because they grow in shadier conditions Doesn't mean that you can't find them growing in full sun as well for some of them. So there is definitely some wiggle room with that categorization. In general, again, you're going to find that many of them have more of a broader leaf than grasses found in other habitats and have kind of a darker green foliage color. These are generalizations. And you'll see as we go to a few of the grasses, I have some pictures of when it's growing in the shade versus when it's growing with more sun, and you'll see that color change in the leaves with a more brighter, like lime green, the more sunlight it gets. And again, we're going to talk about 12 different species today. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first one that we're going to talk about is giant cane. Giant cane is definitely going to be focused down in southernmost Illinois. It is a native grass and it is our only native woody grass in Illinois. It can grow quite tall. So we say, between 5 and 20 feet tall. And the easiest way to identify it when you're out in the field is to look for that woody stem that just resembles bamboo. Especially if you're in an area where you know there's not any like ornamental bamboo that's escaped. This is going to be kind of your only option, okay? And it's definitely not going to have as big of a stem as you would get in an ornamental bamboo. This is going to be a lot thinner. When we look at the leaves, you'll find these kind of dense, kind of fan-shaped collections of leaves most of the time that are typically quite shiny and kind of dark green. Again, the two pictures on the outside, that's grown in the shade. And then I did find this clump of giant cane growing in full sun, and you can see more of that lime green color. And it also has a much broader leaf, so that can vary to the width of the leaves. If you need another characteristic, it has a hairy ligule. And this species is really interesting because it is clonal, spreads pretty aggressively via rhizomes. And then that whole colony will flower once in its lifetime and then die back. I have not been lucky enough to see giant cane in flower, so I don't have any pictures of that to share with you. But something that is pretty cool. I have seen at one point a giant cane break that I visited one year, then I came back the next year. And to my knowledge, no other changes happened in that site, so and it was gone the next year. So I do believe it flowered and then died back. Again, you can see kind of the range in southern Illinois. And a few other close-up pictures. So we're going to be looking for more of that woody stem here. We can see up close. The hairy ligule is interesting on giant cane. It's just a few sparse hairs that emerges at the top of that leaf sheath. Okay, we can kind of see that here. Again, you can see a really broad, light-colored leaf here and a rather skinny, darker green leaf. Again, more of that fan shape. That's what we're going to use for giant cane. Okay, our next grass is bottlebrush grass, Elymus hystrix. This is the first of our ryegrasses that we're going to look at across the course of this week. We're going to look at 4 different species of ryegrasses. There are about 10 in the state, but about half of them are really rare and restricted to a specific type of habitat or just a few counties. We're going to focus on the ones that you're likely to see. As you can tell from the range map here, it's been found in every county in the state. Okay, this is a native grass. It's typically restricted to higher quality woods, but again, it's found in every county in the state, so it can grow in more of a savanna landscape too. I've even seen it growing in prairie plantings and more full sun. This is going to be a cool season grass, so there you go, an example of a native cool season grass. Typically stays under 5 feet tall. For the most part, our ryes in general are going to have darker green, kind of hairless, weak leaves. And hopefully as I click through these pictures, you'll see what I mean by a weak leaf. Some are held very strongly out from a stem, but these are not, that's not the case in the ryes. And a lot of them, especially in bottlebrush grass, are going to curve to show kind of the shiny underside of the leaf. And again, we'll look at a picture of that in a second. They have both a short membranous ligule as well as auricles. So the auricles, again, are those little arms, and those are going to be present in the ryegrasses as a group. So that's one key um, characteristic that you could be looking at the ryes. There are other grasses that also have auricles, but the ryes are one of them. And then when we look at that inflorescence, it's going to be a spike that looks like a bottle brush. So I love it when a common name actually describes what we're looking at, easy to remember. And then within that, we're going to have paired spikelets again with awns. So let's take a bit of a closer look. Here we go with our bottle brush grass. We can see our auricles here as well as our membranous ligule. In this picture, this is a later in the season photo, so those auricles have fallen away. We don't have that as a characteristic anymore, but we still have that ligule. So again, early in the season, that's going to be a much more reliable characteristic to look for. And then this photo over here is showing how that leaf blade is going to curve and form, show you that shiny underside of the leaf. Okay, there's a few grasses that do that we'll look at today, but kind of a different way that they hold their leaves. And then kind of taking a zoom in at that spike, you can see here we're going to have our spikelets kind of spaced out along our rachis, right? The stem of our spike. But they are going to come in pairs here. You can see that they're held perpendicular to one another. And then each of them is going to have 2 awns per spikelet. Okay, so again, bottle brush grass. So that's our first rye. Now we're going to move into Virginia wild rye, our second wild rye that we can find. Again, found across Illinois in every county. This one can definitely go from sun to shade. So we will find it in savannas, woods, prairies. It is, again, a cool season grass, but it's going to be a little bit shorter than bottlebrush grass. It says 1 to 4 feet. Typically, when I see this one, it's under 2 feet tall. It's going to have those same wide, weak, shiny leaves. They can still turn and show their undersides. It's going to have that short membranous ligule. It's going to have the auricles. It's also going to have a spike. But a few things on the spike are going to be a little bit different. Our whole inflorescence is going to be a lot denser. You'll see that those spikelets are held a lot closer to one another than in the bottlebrush grass. And our awns are going to be a lot shorter and they're going to be held upright versus those spikelets and those awns that were held perpendicular to one another and kind of to the stem as well. Okay, so taking a couple closer looks, we'll see those auricles right here. Again, early in the season, a lot of times you'll see that red color, but it's not always there. And then with this one here, you can see kind of that curved leaf that curves right at the base of the blade and shows that shiny underside. Okay, again, another close-up view. You can see much denser spikelets held upright with shorter awns also held upright. Kind of those different, excuse me, the way that the spikelets are held, the size, the length of the awns, and how they're held is going to help distinguish the different ryes from one another. Okay, Virginia wild rye is number 2. Number 3 is silky wild rye, Elymus villosus, again found throughout the state in every county. In our woods and on our woodland edges, so kind of getting more of that sunshade mix. This is going to be more on the size of the Virginia wild rye, a little bit shorter. Again, has a lot of the same characteristics. I don't need to go through them all individually, but what's different on this one is it's going to be hairy. So with that silky name, it's from the silky hairs that you find along this grass. So you're going to find those hairs on the leaves, on the leaf blades, on the leaf sheaths. You're also going to find them on the spikelets and the awns themselves, as you can kind of see in this photo. With this one as well, the whole spike is going to nod to the side. So whereas Virginia wild rye stayed upright, this spike is going to nod to the side. Hmm. Okay, looking at some photos. Again, this is early growth of this plant, and you can see just how hairy it is. So these long, soft, silky hairs that are going to be along our leaf sheath, along our leaf blade. We can see them here. Looking up close, we can find those auricles, or those little arms. And then this is what this grass is going to look like about now, this time of year. So I want to point out in this picture too, you can see all the green and blooming plants behind it, but do you see how it's turned more of that straw color? That's typical of your cool season grasses this time of the year. They're going to look basically dead, right? Dead and dried out. So another clue, if you see this time of year, oh, that's probably a cool season grass. And then you can see how those spikes are nodding to the side. This one in general, I feel like looks a little bit more delicate, not as densely packed as the Virginia wild rye, right, with those spikelets. And then hopefully in this picture on the right here, you can see all of those little hairs. So quite a few different characteristics that help tell them apart. Okay, so based on what we just talked about, go ahead and enter in the chat if you would like, or just answer yourself A, B, and C, which rye is which. Remember, we had bottlebrush grass, Virginia wild rye, and silky wild rye. We're going to talk about Canada wild rye tomorrow. That's going to be, I think, tomorrow in the prairie grasses. All right. Excellent. Most of us are getting it. We've got the Virginia wild rye on the left. We've got the silky wild rye in the middle. And then we've got the bottlebrush grass on the right. Excellent job, everyone. Now we need to do a review a week from now and see if you remember it. It's easy right now. We just talked about it. Um, all right. Let's move on to our next grass. We're going to look at poverty oatgrass. Danthonia spicata is our next little native woodland grass. This one's going to be scattered throughout Illinois, so not found in every county. And this is the only grass in its genus. Okay, so we just looked at, right, 3 different ryes out of 10 in Illinois. This is the only Danthonia grass in Illinois. This one is, I think, super easy to identify based on a single characteristic, but let's go through them all. So it is another native grass. You're gonna find it a lot of the times in more sandy or rocky woods, in glades, even in some prairies, but I typically find it in shadier areas with more like exposed rock is typically where I find it. It is a small cool season bunch grass. When it's not in bloom, the foliage itself is typically under a foot tall, if not under 6 inches tall. So very small grass. And the way I identify it is to look for the curly dead leaves. That's the only thing I ever use probably ever. I think I've only seen it in bloom once. It has a short bloom window and the blooms are pretty insignificant. So typically what I do is look for, it's basically corkscrew, right? Very tight ringlets of dead grass leaves that are all in that bunch. If you want to look for a few other things, it does have a hairy ligule and it has a panicle inflorescence with awned spikelets. Okay, so this is kind of going to be more of your picture in the fall. This is your picture in the spring. So you can't really see the curled dead leaves as it is, but in person, if you were up close, they're definitely still there. They retain those throughout the season, so they're always there. Okay, so again, another picture because it's just so cool looking. But on the right, you can see that hairy ligule. So just a tuft of white hairs. You can see there's also some sparse hairs on the leaves. Again, some of these we need a lot of detailed characteristics, and some we don't. So we'll keep it simple with this one. Okay. This panicle, really difficult to photograph because it really has just a few branches and a few spikelets. I'd say maybe 12 and under spikelets per panicle. So just a few. This is right at the top, so you can barely see any branches. You might be like, that looks kind of like a raceme. That looks like a really short branch. But as we get further down, they were longer, so we do call it a panicle. And then here, this is what it's going to look like when it's dried out. So if you went out now into the fall, this is what you might see. And you can see kind of some remains of those little awns that are poking out of the spikelets there. Okay, so poverty oatgrass. So again, this one, size, super small, tiny little bunch grass, growing in rocky exposed areas with the dead leaves. Poverty oatgrass. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is a brome grass. Hairy woodland brome, Bromus pubescens. And there are a lot of different bromes in Illinois, about 20 different species. And most of them are non-native, but not all of them. We're going to look at a few non-natives when we get to the nuisance grass day on Thursday. But this one is a native, so desirable grass to have. It can be found in your woods, in more savanna areas, and then even in bottomland or floodplain areas. So it's kind of broad in its distribution. Again, nearly every county in Illinois, you can find this grass. The bromes are all cool season grasses. This one typically stays under 4 feet tall. This is another one that's going to have a weaker, more floppy leaf. And it doesn't have a dense number of leaves along the stems, so typically only about 4 to 7. That's important in telling it apart from a few other bromes that are less common but leafier along their stems. So if you are looking for that, like a fringed woodland brome, and a leafy woodland brome, which has a good name, are going to have at least 9 to 15 leaves along their stems. Okay. I didn't put it on here, but the leaf sheaths and blades are hairy. I guess I just assumed it's in the name. So do note that hairy leaf sheaths and leaf blades. Um, Short membranous ligule. And then we're going to have a panicle. So again, this is kind of our more typical panicle arrangement where we have those longer branches. It's more of a drooping open form. And then we are going to have hairs on our spikelets as well and some awns. So let's take a closer look. Again, we can see kind of these, they're going to be soft white hairs, not really bristly and stiff. We could talk about the differences in hairs on grasses, but we'll just do that as we go through the different ones. So softer white hairs, you can see that membranous ligule right here. So it's more yellow in color, kind of starting to brown on the top. And then there's some really fine hairs, hard to photograph, easy to feel also on the leaves. Okay, and then wanted to show a few different pictures because something that can trick people when you're doing grass identification and you see an inflorescence is it can look different depending on when you see it. So these two pictures on the left, this is in full bloom. So those spikelets, all those different pieces of that spikelet, it's all kind of puffed out and popped open. We can see the anthers or the male reproductive structures are yellow and they're kind of hanging out the side. And then you've got these white fluffy little stigmas. That's the female part of the grass. It's all exposed. Okay. So before and after that happens, your spikelet's going to be more tightly closed like you see in the pictures on the right. So it can kind of completely change the look of some of these grasses depending on when you see them. So as much as I can, I try to include pictures of both of those so you can kind of have those reference points. But other things that we can point out and see here, we do have some small little awns. And then I did point on this photo all the way on the right, you can see those dense white soft hairs even all over those spikelets. So if you're able to, again, look under some magnification, usually that can help you see all of those dense white hairs. So hairy grass in the woods, cool season. I'd start with a hairy woodland brome. Look and see if it matches those characteristics. Okay. Our next one that we're going to look at, I like to call river oats. If you know it by a different name, feel free to put that in the chat because there's a few other ones out there. Casmanthium latifolium. Again, this is going to be more of a southern Illinois, central southern Illinois plant, although it is widely used in landscaping as well. So you may be familiar with it from that context. It is a native grass. You can find it typically in wetter areas, so it does like being in moist woods, bottomland woods, along streams. It is a cool season grass, but it's an interesting cool season grass because it blooms a little bit later than most of them. Typically stays 2 to 4 feet tall, and it is very aggressive. So you can see it. These pictures are both from planted patches of it, and it spreads like crazy. So if it's something you're thinking about adding to your landscape, definitely make sure it's in an enclosed space or in a pot and that you watch it. But really, really great in its natural habitat. It is fantastic. So back to identification, it has these broad leaves. It does have a short, hairy ligule, but it's very difficult to see. And then the inflorescence is going to be kind of a drooping panicle, so you can kind of see those whole clusters of spikelets are going to kind of droop to one side. We'll look at the spikelets up close. They look really like flattened oats. And then the foliage can turn kind of a golden orange color in the fall. You can kind of see that in the one on the bottom right. It didn't really turn super golden that year, but can have some kind of four-season garden interest. Okay, I included this picture on the left because it doesn't look like it should. It looks like this has oracles, and I have looked at lots of different pictures of river oats and researched this, and everything says it does not have oracles, but I found this one that makes it look like it does. So again, plants don't always follow the rules, and I would say look at multiple different specimens if you have them, because I doubt that they all looked like this, but apparently the one that I found looks like it has oracles. I don't really see a hairy ligule on this. But I looked at a few other photos that I had and I saw a few sparse hairs. So this one's tricky. I wouldn't necessarily use those characteristics for the most part. This has such a distinctive leaf blade, excuse me, clonal form, and then flowering structures that you don't really need these characteristics. But you can kind of see it has that broader leaf. It tapers at the point and at the base. Some other broader leaves are going to wrap around and kind of clasp the stem base. This one just barely does that, not really going or wrapping around that whole stem, just a little bit at the base. Okay, and then taking a closer look at those oats, they are extremely flat. They start off green and they can turn more of this golden color. Again, this is one that will change color depending on how much sunlight it gets. It just so happens that most of my photos are of it in planted settings in full sun. And this right here in the middle is kind of when those oats are just starting to emerge, so they don't quite look like this because they're just kind of being pushed out of those shoots. Okay, river oats, Chrysanthemum latifolium. In the right context, it's fantastic. I love it. But some people absolutely hate it. So, did anyone put, let's check in the chat. What other names do we know river oats by? I see some in here. Inland oats, upland oats, northern sea oats. Excellent. Those are the ones I know that I've heard of that's referred to. Anyone else have any others? Inland sea oats. I go for river oats because where we are, it grows along the river. We don't have a sea in Illinois, so I think that one's kind of silly, but names don't always make sense. Okay, let's move on to our next grass. This is going to be fowl manna grass in the Glyceria genus, another grass that we have in every county in Illinois. Okay. Um, let's see. In this genus, there are 7 different species. This is by far the most common. There's another one, eastern manna grass, that's more of a northeastern Illinois grass that you may find, but it does have a broader leaf blade than this one here. So that's a little bit of how we tell those apart. But for the most part, I kind of default to this one as it's the most common. It is native. It's another native cool season grass. Apparently, all of the woodland grasses tend to be cool season grasses in today's talk. You're going to find it in wetter areas. So wetter woodlands, more of a swampy area, a marshy area. This patch that I found was kind of on a woodland edge, like a low woodland edge. Near some ponds. Typically going to stay under 3 feet tall. And this one is going to have kind of longer, narrow leaves that taper to a point and are held not perfectly perpendicular to the stem, but we'll look at some photos where you can see um, they're held a lot differently than, say, a bottlebrush grass or those weak leaves that I talked about that curve. These are really stiffly held out from the stem. It's going to have a tall membranous ligule, and then the most gorgeous part are these drooping panicle inflorescences, and all of these really, really tiny, small spikelets that are kind of packed onto the branches, but typically again found on like the upper half of the branches. So let's take a closer look. So here we can see kind of that attempt at holding the leaves perpendicular, right? But some grasses, sometimes we can describe the leaves as being held out like rungs on a ladder, okay? So perpendicular to that main stem. And again, a lot more stiffly than we would find than some of the other grasses. Here we have the membranous ligule. This one in this case is shredded, and I cannot remember if that's a typical thing that you find or not. There are certain grasses that membrane is typically shredded. I would have to double check on this one if that's typical or not, but that can happen for sure. But tall membranous ligule, and again, just kind of pointing out in general how the leaves are held more stiffly. You can see there's no hairs, no hairs on the stem, no hairs on the sheath, no hairs on the blades. Okay, and then a close-up view of the panicle. So this one's a lot daintier, right? It's a lot smaller in size. Our spikelets are tiny. They're more densely packed. I'm going to change my mind and say on the upper 3/4 of the branches, not the upper half. But you can see where then we have some blank space on the bottom of those branches here. And again, just some closer views. Fowl manna grass. Okay, in this species, our leaves are going to stay pretty narrow. And if you had some broader ones, we might have to look into a different manna grass, a different glyceria. Okay, We are moving right along. We're going to go into our next woodland grass, which is wood reed, Cinna arundinacea. Okay, this is one of two species in that Cinna genus in Illinois. This is the more common one. And again, through its distribution, you can see it's been found in nearly every county in the state. Um, this one is going to be native and warm season. So we are going to get a warm season woodland grass in here. Gonna find it again in wetter areas, in more of our floodplain woods, swampy areas. I also typically find it on like woodland edges. Um, in a lot of different circumstances, like next to a bike trail through the woods, I'll find this one. Typically, we find this and we say higher quality habitat, but I've seen it on enough roadsides or ditches areas that I don't know how true that is or if that's just where I always see it. This is going to be a taller grass, so it's going to be, between 4 and 6 feet tall. Again, warm season, so it's probably getting ready to start or starting to bloom right about now, end of July. I typically don't talk about different shades of green when we look at grasses because that can be difficult to differentiate. But we already looked at kind of the bright green versus the dark green. Sometimes we have like grayer or bluer foliage, and it's really hard to see in pictures. But when you're out scanning a landscape, you can kind of see more of that gray green. It'll kind of jump out at you. So sometimes I see that in the wood reed as more of a gray color to that foliage. We're going to have a tall membranous ligule on this grass. And this is another one that's going to twist its leaves to show the shiny undersides. It's going to produce a panicle inflorescence with kind of upward facing branches that we can see here and more elongated spikelets. This one is just senesced and has nodded over near the end of the season, which you can also find as characteristic of this grass, with everything kind of drooping to the side once it's finished flowering and it starts to turn more of that straw color. Okay, a few close-up pictures. These kind of on the left are showing how it's curving those leaves, right? Happens right at the base of that blade. If you don't know what you're looking for, you don't even realize that it's twisted. But taking a closer look, you can see that. This one, I think, to me, shows more of the gray color. And then we have our membranous ligule again. This is later in the season, so it's brown or orange in color. And then a few panicle pictures. Again, this is kind of our stereotypical panicle, lots of branches. This one's pretty densely packed with more of those elongated spikelets. And then the photo all the way on the right, you can see once it's flowered, once it starts to die back, turns a brown color, and everything kind of curves to one side. Okay, beaked panic grass is next. If you took this presentation with me 6 years ago, it had a different scientific name then. It was Panicum anceps. It's been reassigned into one that's a lot more difficult to say, Coleotinea anceps. So it's been moved out of the panic grasses into a different genus where there are 5 different species in Illinois. This is the most common one, but it is pretty restricted to southern Illinois in that area. This one, I could have put it in a few different categories. I find it more on woodland edges, old fields, disturbed areas, so it can kind of go sun to shade. It is a warm season native grass. I also probably could have put it in the nuisance grass because it is a little bit of a weedier plant, but I've never seen it kind of take over and be problematic, so I kept it in this section. Typically under 4 feet tall. And this one has a characteristic we haven't talked about yet. It has what we call a keeled leaf. And that essentially means that, and I think I'm referring to the sheath itself, and I misspoke on that. Yeah, we're going to find a keeled leaf and leaf sheath, which means that those structures look like they were folded like a piece of paper and they retain that crease, that really strong crease. We're going to find hairs also on the edges of the leaf sheath on this grass, as well as a membranous ligule. And then we can see in these photos panicle inflorescence with kind of these oval shaped spikelets with pointed or beaked tips. That's where that name comes from. So taking a closer look, again, hard to see in the photos, but it's going to be more of that sheath here that if I had it at a different angle, you would see a really strong crease that looks like it was folded. So you'll see that keeled characteristic here. On this one, when we say a short membranous ligule, we mean short, like almost non-existent, but you can see this little brown line. That is a ligule in this one. I also tend to find that it has more of this translucent or this clear midrib. I didn't list that, but that is another thing that you could look for in this grass. It's going to have kind of more of a shiny leaf too. Okay, a couple different views of the panicles. Again, we see all those branches, we see all of those small little pointed spikelets. When it's in bloom, it has kind of these really deep red, almost purple anthers that are pushed out of those spikelets. And then it can also turn more of like a reddish color too as it matures. So you can kind of see that here. Beaked panic grass. Okay, we're just flying today. We've got two more grasses in the woodland grasses, so we will finish a bit early. But we're going to move into the Dicanthelium genus. These are also called panic grasses, but other panic grasses that aren't in the Panicum genus. They used to be, but they were reclassified into their own. Dicantheliums are notoriously difficult to identify. I feel like I found two of the easiest ones too, and that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at another one tomorrow also. There are about 33, 34 different species of Dicanthelium in Illinois, so we have a lot of options to work with. Um, and I think most of them, if not all of them, are native. So this one, Bosc's panic grass, is a native to mostly southern Illinois, but you can see that it's crept up into a few northern Illinois counties too. Um, Typically pretty short, 1 to 2 feet tall. And it has these broad, short leaves that slightly clasp the stem. But the characteristic, again, the one and only characteristic that I use is to look at the nodes for these really dense white downward facing hairs. Very specific characteristic. If I'm in the woods, I see a shorter grass with broad leaves. I look for those nodes. If I see that, I know it's Bosc's panic grass. Okay. But continuing on, it does have a panicle inflorescence. All of the dicantheliums have panicle inflorescences, and they have these large, well, the size varies, but they have round, very round spikelets. In this one, they are the largest of the dicantheliums, and they have purple anthers as well. That's another characteristic you can tell. And the dicantheliums as a group in general, most of them are going to bloom twice in the season. So they're cool season grasses, so they're going to bloom in the spring. But then they also, in the fall, a lot of them will put out side shoots and bloom a second time with self-fertile flowers that don't need outcrossing as kind of a backup for their seed production. So taking a closer look, look at those downward facing white fluffy hairs on the node. Very interesting. You can see it here. You can see it here, here, here. That's all you need for this one. Again, broad leaf, slightly clasping or starting to kind of enclose that stem, tapers to a point. And then when it is in bloom, panicle with quite round for a spikelet. And then this one you can see is in bloom, so you can see those purple anthers that are hanging out in the wind. Okay, the last one we're going to look at Dicanthelium laxiflorum. This one we just call in general panic grass. So just because we have a grass doesn't mean it's gotten its own specific common name. So some of the less common grasses, although I see this one all the time, again, it's where I'm located in far southern Illinois. Um, just like the Bosc's panic grass is Dicanthelium boscii. It got that Bosc title. There's so many of them that not all of them have a specific different common name. So this one is a panic grass. I would refer to it by its Latin name, Dicanthelium laxiflorum. So small little woodland grass, stays under a foot tall, and has really softly hairy leaves and stems. Makes that little panicle inflorescence with the small round spikelets. So we find bunches of it growing in the woods, on the rocks, among the moss. I've even seen it in more of a lawn setting in more of like a wooded area. So if we're, at say a state park and we're hiking in the woods and then we start moving into an area that's now managed as lawn, I'll often see this grass as one of those grasses there. You can see all the dense, long, white, soft hairs. A couple other pictures of that. Hard to photograph this one. But again, you can kind of see all of those hairs, this small grass. This one I would find you would probably be most likely to confuse with a sedge. It looks more like one of our low-growing, bunched, broad-leaved sedges that we have. But again, I would look for that round stem. I'd look for a node to differentiate between a sedge and this grass. And then a couple pictures of it in bloom. Again, it's a cool season grass, so it'll bloom early in the spring. I usually miss it in bloom, but have this panicle with those small round spikelets. Okay, we made it. We're going to do a review. If you have the handout pulled up or printed, you have all the answers. I figured you would want them, so I left them in there. But we're just going to review by pointing out some key characteristics. And if you want to put in the chat an example that you can remember from today that we talked about. So our first one's going to be give me a grass that had oracles that we looked at today. You can go genus level, you can go species level, but pop those in the chat. Again, these are the characteristics we're going to look for. We talked about, what, 12 grasses today? And 3 of them, I want to say, had oracles. So small subset, that's a good characteristic. If you find it, that helps you narrow down what you're looking at. I see a lot of answers coming in the chat. Thank you. A lot of the ryegrasses, and you are correct. So remember, our bottlebrush, our Virginia, and our silky wild rye all have those oracles. Okay, moving on. We looked at a lot of ligules. We saw a lot of membranous ligules. We saw a few hairy ligules. So if you can remember one of the grasses that had a hairy ligule, go ahead and pop that into the chat. Typically what we find is a membranous ligule is super common. Hairy is less common. No ligule is pretty rare. There's only one grass that I know of that has no ligule in Illinois. That doesn't mean there aren't more. I don't know every grass. But so far that's what we found. Okay, hairy ligules is gonna be the giant cane. Very good. And the poverty oatgrass. Some of the other grasses are going to have hairs in other spots, so hairs on the nodes, or hairs on the leaves or the leaf sheaths, but the hairy ligule, giant cane, poverty oatgrass. Okay, how about awns? A grass with awns. We talked about a lot of them. Grass with awns. Excellent. We got some more guesses coming in. We talked about quite a few. I'll pop them up here. We've got the Bottlebrush, all the rise again, but also our hairy woodland brome, our poverty oatgrass, all had awns. Okay, and then one that had a panicle. Remember we talked about panicles, racemes, and spikes. Panicle is going to be that branched inflorescence. Some of them have it in the name. I saw someone put in there panic grass. That's an easy one to remember. The panic grasses all have panicles. Excellent. Fowl manna, wood reed. We did talk about smooth brome. We didn't do a profile on it yet, but yes, as a panicle, hairy woodland, river oats. Great, great, excellent. So again, just kind of showing how hopefully we're starting to get the picture of what a panicle looks like. They have some similarities, but they also can be a little bit different, right? If they're held straight up, if they bend to the side, the size, shape of the spikelets differs a lot. So all of these listed here all have panicles. Give an example of a grass that has leaves that twist to show their undersides. Leaves that twist to show the undersides. Excellent. We've got a lot of wood reeds in here. The elemis, specifically the bottlebrush grass. Exactly, yeah. So most of the rise, yes, I just put the bottlebrush grass in here because I had a good picture of it and the wood reed. But you are correct. Very good. Think that's my last one, the last quiz for the day. We're going to go over a couple logistics and then we'll do some questions. So just some resources for you. What do I use for grass identification? I really like Lauren Brown's books. I had her original, I think 1979 publication. And then during COVID times, she came out with a new version in partnership with Ted Elliman, not just grasses, but grasses, sedges, and rushes. Great identification guide. Again, doesn't have everything in it, but it at least can get you started. If you can get to a genus, then you can really start to narrow down the specifics of that from there. So really, really great start. I recommend that book. If you're looking for identification of seedlings, if you're doing like more of a prairie restoration work, this one will kind of be more relevant when we talk about tomorrow's grasses. The Tallgrass Prairie Center has a guide to seed and seedling ID in the upper Midwest. It's very specific, but it is an excellent guide and it does have some useful characteristics for grass seedlings as well as other prairie plants. And then the Illinois Wildflowers website is often my go-to, has more identification information than you would ever want. And it is extremely thorough and has excellent descriptions of differences between these grasses and look-alike grasses. So highly recommend checking out that website. Again, doesn't have everything, but has a lot of different grasses. And then wildflowers and other plants as well. Okay. There has been a lack of grass ID resources, so that's been one of my missions is to increase that. So you can find my references at Grasses at a Glance at go.illinois.edu/grasses. You can find, we have a whole grass website at Illinois Extension. I have a blog that I typically write for. I skipped this week because of these webinars. I have a short video series as well as recorded webinars. So like this one you're attending live today, I have the one from 6 years ago up there too. Up next, tomorrow we'll have prairie grasses, Thursday nuisance. Same time frame. We'll go as long as we need. We are a little bit early today. If you joined today, that first half hour that we did was a grass ID term explanation. We're going to do an abbreviated version of that each of the next 2 days as both a refresher and for folks who may have missed one of the days so that they're not thrown in with no term overview. So the first 10 minutes is going to be a review. If you're running a little bit late or if you need that review, just know that's how we're going to begin. I do have a QR code for the slides, and I know Kim has been putting it back in the chat. We'll get that in there maybe one more time if you can do that for me, Kim. And then you'll also get another reminder email every day. I'm going to have it come out about noon in case you're just like, where is that Zoom link? We'll get that email to you so it comes out ahead of time. If you have specific questions, you're always welcome to email me. I'm happy to get back to you. But at this time, I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you, Kim, but Kim, if you want to point out if we have any other questions that I can help answer, we have plenty of time to do that today. But I do also want to say just thank you for being here. We are at almost 300 people. We had over 600 people sign up for this webinar series. So that tells me that people want to learn about grasses. So thank you for being here. I'm happy to do this for you all. So Kim, any questions?
Yeah, we have a few more that are coming in. One of the ones that I did a little bit of assistance with is how do you feel is iNaturalist accurate for identifying grasses?
Oh,
I answered, I thought it would depend on the information that you were sharing with the app. Are you providing a picture of the full grass? Are you providing the flower and the seeds? Again, I think grass ID can be tricky if you don't have all those parts.
yeah, for sure. I will say it has gotten way better. When I first started trying to use iNaturalist or Seek or some of those apps for grass identification, it was not great. It is really helpful now. So with a lot of those apps, right, certain ones are better than others. So I recommend iNaturalist. That's kind of my go-to. Um, it's going to give you a confidence level, right? So if you have the flowering portion of the grass, right, in general, that's what you're going to kind of need to get the most accurate identification. So I always use it as a tool. I use it as a starting point. I look at what it says, and then I'll go research that individual grass in maybe like a field guide to get some more, or on Illinois wildflowers to get some more detailed identification characteristics, and then try to match that with the grass. It's still hard, right? If it's not in bloom, it's hard for me. It's hard for an app. Grasses are challenging. Sometimes we can't get to that ID, but I will say that iNaturalist is excellent and is really great even with the grasses.
Another question that came in, and again, this is a little off topic since it's about management versus identification, but
Okay.
are there any species that can outcompete or hold their ground in a monoculture of reed canary grass on a very steep stream bank?
I don't have an easy answer for that. My answer is I wish. Um, It's with some of these invasives, it is extremely challenging. They're just so good at spreading and forming that colony and those rhizomes that like I don't have an easy answer. Some others, right, you're gonna need to like have another very aggressive grass. So like a river oats, right? If you're able to manage and knock back and treat that reed canary very aggressively over multiple years and then put something back in, you know, maybe. Um, I don't have personal experience with that, so I can't vouch for if that would work or not. If others do and you want to drop it in the chat, I'm all for community sharing of experiences with management. It's definitely challenging.
And I would say, like on that end, what I would think of is it depends again on how you're managing. So if you're choosing to use grass specific herbicides, like maybe you could try to aggressively put in some broadleaf willows or dogwood or elderberry as to potentially fight so that you could continue to use grass specific herbicide.
That's a
But
great point, Kim.
it's going to be really, really tricky. And I wish you luck. I definitely know a few places up north where that is a serious problem.
Yeah, for sure.
Going back to the chat with some questions, We had a couple of fun ones that I looked up. How did panic grass get its name? Panic grass gets its name from the Latin word panis, meaning a swelling ear of millet or fibrous head. Panis is known as bread, and so it's referencing those millet-like clusters, but it does not have any connection to the Greek god of Pan. There was another person who asked, are the leaves of fowl manna grass always narrow? And usually they're categorized to be narrow and medium width, but I don't know, Erin, if you had more information about that.
Yeah, just I think I saw that one pop in, so I mentioned, yeah, they're typically more narrow, and then if you had a broader leaf on what you thought was a foul manna, it might be that eastern manna grass, so a different species.
Other questions that came in, can you find poverty oats on talus slopes along bluffs? And I would say yes. Um, some folks were concerned, could you, without the seed head, would you be able to identify river oats and Japanese stilt grass? And I would say yes,
Mm-hmm. That
because of that off-centered white, um, strip on a Japanese stilt grass. And I think you will be talking about that in the future.
Yeah, that's a good lookalike. Some yeah, I didn't even think of those. In general, right, the stilt grass, which we'll talk about on Thursday, is an annual grass, so it does tug very easily out of the ground, whereas your river oats is gonna fight you from being tugged out of the ground. And then the river oats, again, I don't use a lot of um length measurements because it can get so technical and it's difficult. Like the broadleaf in a river oats is going to be like an inch across, whereas the broadleaf in a stilt grass is going to be like half an inch. If we held them side by side, stilt grass leaves are going to be like a quarter of the size of a river oats. And then, like Kim said, that off center kind of white or translucent midrib in a stilt grass is also going to be another way to tell it apart. Yeah, but also, they both grow very aggressively in colonies and similar types of habitats. So yeah, that's a great look-alike comparison.
And I had one last question that I didn't get to in the chat, but
Okay.
when you were talking about the woodland grasses, would you say that the roots of all of these grasses are about the same, I'm assuming, size as part of that question? Do you have any ideas about that?
That's a good question. No, they're gonna vary. Just in general, right? We talked about a lot of different sized grasses. So like the small little 6-inch panic grass or the poverty oat grass. Um, is likely going to have different sized roots than your woodreed. I don't really know the woodland grasses, honestly. I haven't really looked into their root lengths myself. Prairie grasses get all of the credit for their incredibly long roots, but even among those, it's going to vary based on species, based on, specific habitat that it's growing in. If it's in a glade or a rocky area, it's probably going to have shorter roots because it's just more restricted in that way. Um, but yeah, it's going to vary based on um, species as well. Are they fibrous roots? Are they rhizomatous roots? Is it an annual or a perennial? Right, all of that goes into that. So it'll be different.
And I think that is our questions for the day, unless anybody has any to add to the chat.
I am seeing a couple that just came in. I don't have a blog on Paspalum species because those are notoriously difficult to tell apart, and I haven't sat down and dove into that myself yet. Maybe I will now that that request has come in. And then just about comparing invasives to natives in photos. We'll see. Maybe I'll add a few more things. I will say also, if you did download the handouts from today early in the day, I found a few typos and other things. I made some changes and uploaded a new version today. So if you have downloaded them early and printed them, for the most part, no major changes are going to happen. I know folks like to have them early, so I put them up, but I might make a few other changes as we go. Otherwise, I think we'll pause for today. Thank you again. Same link tomorrow to join the Zoom, same time, same link to the handouts. And we will see you tomorrow for prairie grasses at 1 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim, also.